You're listening to the REI Marketing Nerds Podcast, the leading resource for real estate investors who want to dominate their market online. Dan Barrett is the founder of AdWords Nerds, a high-tech digital agency focusing exclusively on helping real estate investors like you get more leads and deals online, outsmart your competition, and live a freer, more awesome life. And now, your host, Dan Barrett.
Hey guys, welcome back. You're listening to the second part of last week's episode. Let's jump back in.
So I want to ask, this is a question I've been mulling over since we first met. We talked a little bit about what you guys do. And this is more of a generalist question, but I want to tap into your sort of scholarly background. And my question is, how much control do you feel we actually have over the direction of, let's say, the cities, the growth of cities in America? And how much control do we actually want, right? And I was thinking about a while back, I was reading about, I think it's Brasilia, right? Which is like the capital city of Brazil, which is this very, very consciously architected city designed around, sort of, I think what the author calls high modernist sort of ideas about how cities should work. And in practice, and I've never been there, but what I read was in practice, the experience of actually living there is sort of oddly off-putting, right? There's this sort of sense of being in a manufactured space that somehow is not 100% humanistic, or however you want to put that, right? It's a little too artificial. And it strikes me that like a lot of the, if you think about, at least to the American sensibility, the European cities that seem so beautiful and so amazing are the ones that have cobblestone streets that like don't go in a straight line, and like it's all very kind of all over the place. So I'm curious how you think about that, being in this sort of realm of, obviously you're not designing an entire city, but you are helping people make decisions to sort of corral the growth of cities in many ways. How much control do we really have over that process? And how much control is maybe desirable to have over that process versus letting things happen organically?
I had a conversation last night with a neighborhood friend whose son is interested in becoming an urban planner. And he said, "What do you think of that career interest, John?" And I said, "I think that for the coming couple of generations, urban planning is going to be an incredibly, not only valuable, but really dynamic space to be involved." And I think that for a bunch of reasons. I think that obviously on a global scale, we are urbanizing. That continues to shift pretty substantially. And so more and more of the world's population will be living in cities as we go forward. But even beyond that, I think that if we were to look back at the 20th century, particularly in a period of, 10 to 500 years, I think we'll look back and say that the 20th century in many ways was an exceptional one. And what I mean about that is that we really made a lot of decisions about how we would live together in cities based on a set of kind of impulses and a set of incentives that I don't think are going to be the long-term incentives that are in place for cities. So, for example, obviously the interstate freeway system, we rely on it in a lot of ways today, but that system went through a lot of urban areas in a way that I think over the near term and intermediate term, we're going to say, this is not the most productive way to use urban space. And those cities that are making changes to their interstates, whether they're covering them or in some cases just getting rid of where those roadways go through the urban centers, that is picking up speed, and I think that'll be interesting to watch. The way that we have designed places in a very with very segregated uses. So this is a commercial district. This is an institutional district. This is a single-family residential district. This is a multifamily residential district. that also is something that's pretty exceptional from the 20th century. That's not the way that people lived for centuries before that. I don't think that's really the way that many cities are going to operate going forward either. I think there will be much more mixing of that. And you're seeing that in local moves where cities are making changes to zoning codes and their planning documents in order to just create more efficiency and more livability, allow people to make choices about how they move around cities without having to get in a car. Because I think there's a kind of a growing recognition that car dependence is not really an ideal social or environmental or frankly economic outcome. It's actually really isolating. It's not great for our older, our elders who live among us. It's not great for kids, et cetera, et cetera. So my short answer to your question is I think that there's going to be a lot of dynamism in the next, let's say 100 years in cities. And I think the use of data will be really important in kind of helping cities and communities move to the next step of what they're going to look like and how they're going to operate together. The last thing I would say about that is anytime we're living together, and this means not only physically, but also digitally, it means that there are some privacy issues that need attention. And I would say that that is another thing that we're going to need to focus attention on is what is the sort of data privacy rubric that we're putting in place to allow people's data to be used for shared, kind of community goals, but also reflecting the fact that they are entitled to some privacy and some ownership of data that they generate. So that's going to be a tension that we're going to have to navigate together as we're building these cities of the future in the next couple of decades.
So you mentioned a whole bunch of things there that strike me as really, really interesting and things that I do think that even, I'm 42, right? This is the first time, I've got kids or I'm doing the, parent teacher conferences, like that whole thing, right? That's the phase of life that I'm in. And it's really the first time that you sit down and you, at least for me, care about zoning laws or it's like the first time you're like, why is that thing there? You get wrapped up in a local community in a way that just previous to this, I hadn't really. So I'm wondering, when you look out at communities today, is there something that you see happening that you think is a notable mistake, right? Like, where do you think that people get their concepts of that urban space wrong? Is it in the kind of separation of commercial and non-commercial? What do you think people could do differently now to kind of direct their communities in the right direction? I know that's a broad question, so you can tackle that however you like.
I think one answer I would have to that, Dan, is I think just by the nature of local policymaking, you're constantly in a balancing act of trying to create the best outcome based on interests that are oftentimes, not aligned. They may be overlapping in ways that you're trying to kind of ascertain and understand. And I think that one common mistake that I see in the city space is kind of splitting the difference in policy measures. So what I mean by that is like, okay, we're gonna rezone residential property so that instead of only single family, you could do single family up to triplex or up to duplex. And that will help us generate more housing units. It'll give people more property rights that they should have in their hands, et cetera. That is an incremental move that doesn't really create any impact because, as you know, the economics of trying to build a duplex or a triplex on a single family lot, it's not something that's really going to scale effectively, particularly now that we've been through all these supply shocks, et cetera, from the pandemic. The materials and labor, it's just not going to work. So we have to be willing to kind of go to the next step and either choose not to pursue the increment at all, or to go to the other side of the increment and say, okay, we're going to be bold and we're going to say, instead of the single family exclusive lot, you can do single family up to a fourplex. And suddenly you're now into a building form that's a little more cost effective and might actually lead to your goal of stimulating more housing production. That's one example where I just think, maybe instead of saying we've got proposal A and proposal B, let's just let's just find the middle ground. Sometimes the middle ground is not really a place that, it's going to lead to a lot of political challenge, but it's not really going to deliver the outcome. So maybe you just stick with the status quo on that front. And then in another space where you can actually make up some ground, then you go beyond the increment and actually adopt the more robust proposal. You see the same thing in a lot of other ways, like, there's more interest in having alternatives to car driving. So some cities are adopting bike lanes that are just painted surface. And that is kind of the same thing. It's like a middle ground that doesn't really create infrastructure that people are going to feel safe using as an alternative to car dependence. And so you end up sort of with some of both and really neither of either.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me, right? That's a pattern that I see in a lot of different domains. It's this idea that like when you kind of try to strike the golden mean, you get the worst of both possible worlds rather than just choosing your downside and getting all the upside, right? And, it's the bike lane one is funny. I ride my bike, it's like an 8-minute bike ride from my house to work, right? So I ride my bike to work a lot of the time, and we have exactly that. It's just a painted lane. They didn't make the road any bigger. They just painted a lane on it. Right. And I ride on the road, but I notice that most of the people I see riding bikes in town ride on the sidewalk. I'm like, I always get bitter about it. My wife always says I'm too judgmental because I'm like, well, I have to ride in the road. I'm risking my life every day. Why can't they? But it's like, but the people on the road are irritated with me and I'm irritated with them. It's just it's hard to share that space in a lot of ways.
Want to find motivated seller leads online, but don't know where to start? Download our free Motivated Seller Keyword Report today. AdWords nerds have spent over $5 million this year researching the most profitable keywords for finding motivated seller leads. And you can grab these exact keywords when you download our report at www.adwordsnerds.com/keywords.
We've been talking about complexity, and so I'm going to ask you an impossible question, which I think is going to be. But if you're sitting down with an investor and they're saying, "Hey, I'm looking for a way to judge, to make an educated guess, let's say, maybe not a prediction, but an educated guess about the trajectory of a given area I'm looking at, let's say an urban area. I'm thinking about investing in this area. I'm trying to get a sense of where it's headed." If you had to give that person one thing that they could think about or look at to get a sense of the underlying health of a community, could you pick something out that you think would help them make a better decision? I know we just said that like you can't ever separate out causal factors and such, but let's try to be a fun parlor game. Could you think of something that you think would be helpful to that person?
There's a lot of great answers to that question, Dan. That is a use case that we have worked with in the past. And sometimes that party is interested in their block. Sometimes they're interested in a district. Sometimes they're interested in a much larger geography.
Yeah.
And I would say a good starting place for that kind of evaluation really is, particularly given it's 2022, we have a good resource in the form of the census data. And I say that because it allows for strong comparison from 2010 to 2020, for example, or even 2010 and 2020. None of that data is going to, blow people's minds in terms of the behavioral nature of it or the revelation around really fine-grained activity. However, it does give us a really strong kind of underlying basis for understanding where is their movement in a particular area and what does that look like. So we can look at all kinds of things, housing characteristics, demography, how people are moving around in that space, how they get to key destinations, certainly, mobility, who's moving in and moving out of that space, where are they coming from? All those kinds of factors, depending on that client's interest, could be incorporated into a take like that. And that's often a kind of a good step one that we might take with a scope like that. And then we have subsequent steps that we use to kind of dive further into that inquiry and add some additional layers onto it that are more behavioral in nature. But it's a really strong starting place to be able to at least ask those questions and making sure that you're tagging kind of the big themes.
Okay. So I really want to ask and I'm going to ask what's next for Visible City and kind of what you see the sort of future is. Before we leave these sort of really broad topics, I have to ask about your background in economics. I'm fascinated by economics. I go back and forth on how much I think that the sort of academic body of economic knowledge reflects real life and what that may or may not be so. I'm very curious if you think about the sort of proper economics, academic background that you have, is there one sort of idea or mental model you find yourself returning to in your day-to-day work for its explanatory power or maybe its ability to kind of help you make decisions? Is there something you could pull out of that background that you're like, it's all very useful, but there's this one thing, it's just a tool I'm constantly pulling out of my mental toolbox?
None. It's a great question. I would say that one example of that is, I should disclose too that on my team, I'm somewhat famous for mixing metaphors. So I beg your pardon if that might maybe happens, but.
All right. Well, that also is me. So I'm all for a good mixed metaphor. Those are my.
Yes, that's right on.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I have come back to many, many times in my work in the various settings that I described is the sense that, price setting is in its core a behavioral element. And I think that sometimes in the US particularly, I think we start to assign characteristics to prices or to markets that are unfairly comprehensive. We believe that they have rationality that they often don't. And if we think about the fact that individual market participants are sometimes rational and sometimes irrational, so are collections, no matter how large, of individuals which operate as markets. And our recent examples, of course, the caricature of people hoarding toilet paper and things like that. There's maybe a little bit more happening in that sense, but some of those activities or those trends really created a lot of havoc in markets that we have just long believed are totally rational and have an ebb and flow that is always manageable. And in reality, there are real exceptions to that. So that's one piece. I think the second piece I would mention is I have long been a fan of the Freakonomics writings and the podcasts, and I love their approach of taking economic concepts and really stretching their application into areas that, in a classical education, you're typically not going to address those topics using, an economic concept. So thinking about why most drug dealers live with their parents, for example, is a really interesting question that has a lot of layers to it. And you can use economic concepts to dig into these questions that I think are really interesting and much more varied than is often suggested about the sort of economics practice or curriculum.
Right. Yeah. Economics can often seem segregated into its own universe that's kind of divorced from actual activity, but it's just like you said, right? The model transfers over. All right. So let's talk about what's next for Visible City, kind of what you guys are planning, kind of what your goals are, right? I mean, Visible City is such an interesting company. You guys, just like you said, you're at the kind of edge of this massive space that can go in so many different directions. How do you think about what you want to achieve as a team or kind of where you're going? Do you plan it all out? You're like, we have a 10-year plan, and here's what we're going to do. I should have gone with 5-year plans with the communist thing or whatever. But, are you more organic and, you're like, oh, we're dancing with complex systems and who knows? How do you guys think about what you want to achieve and what you want to accomplish?
I would say we're working in a couple of different ways right now. One is we're working on really close attention to the systems, the processes, the sort of assets that we're developing internally, and really trying to be thinking rigorously about how we identify, inventory, and then really carry those assets forward into future projects and client opportunities. Some of that is about when we hear from clients in commercial real estate or in other fields, when we hear a pattern of what we're getting from the marketplace, then sometimes we'll take some of those assets and think about them a little differently, like maybe this is something we should incubate and try to develop in a little different track than our more project-based kind of efforts that we're having in parallel, we're doing in parallel. So that's one piece is kind of the internal focus. The other piece, though, is I think it's an incredibly interesting and arguably turbulent time in the marketplace. So yes, we've got rising interest rates. That's a little unfamiliar from recent history. We're not totally sure how to manage that, but there are other kind of cross currents of, I think, structural change that are at work. You think about the fact that the value of location and the value of the individual attributes of what make a great location, those are all in flux right now. They're all changing, right? Think about the mobility of workforce. This is talked about for office particularly, but it's going to affect every segment of the commercial real estate marketplace. And, demand and supply are going to change in different ways depending on the geography, the submarket, the ownership, the profile of that space, what's around it. All of those things will influence what those spaces are going to look like. And then I think too, just about the nature of work. I'm not totally sure about what the great resignation is or is not, but it's clear that people do have different ideas about what work means and what it does not mean than they had in February of 2020. And that's a cultural shift. There's a movement that has taken place, and I think it's going to be really interesting and challenging at times, but also big opportunities to figure out where that points us as we go forward. So I'm excited about Visible City having a toolbox and having kind of a way of bringing together various dimensions and layers of data to give, medical centers and developers and city agencies and other parties, give them insight about where we see stuff going in the corners, of the world where they're most interested.
Well, man, talk about just Visible City being situated at this really fascinating place. And I think if you are, if you're an investor and you're listening to this, there are so many different questions that a company like Visible City can help you answer, can help you pull together data to make better decisions. It's such a fun, fascinating thing. So for people that want to learn more about you or about Visible City, where are the best places for them to learn about you? Obviously, there's the website, visible.city. Did you do social media or anything like that?
We do, Dan. Yeah, we're on Twitter and we're on LinkedIn. And our contact information is on Facebook, although we don't engage on Facebook because we adopted a data privacy policy about 3 years ago that we feel like Facebook does not comply with. And so we have a space there that gets you to our website, but we don't otherwise engage on that platform. But we do definitely share project examples and other thoughts on Twitter and LinkedIn. We'd love to connect with your listeners there, or of course at our website, visible.city. Always welcome. Yeah, for sure. I will link to all those places at the show notes, which you can get to adwordsnerds.com/podcast. But again, the website, visible.city. Go and check them out. It's really, really cool. They've got some examples of projects that they've worked on and stuff. It's really fascinating. John Commerce, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. This was a real treat for me. I never get to say complex systems theory in this podcast, and I'm always happy whenever I get a chance to bring it up. So thank you so much, man. This was awesome. Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the conversation too, and the invitation. Thanks for reaching out.
That is it. That's it for our interview this week. AdWordsNerds.com is our website, folks. You can go there. You can find all our past episodes, show notes, and more. And I mentioned this at the beginning, obviously, but look, if you're a real estate investor and you're worried about the market right now, and you want to talk about how online marketing can help you get through the hard times, you can go to AdWordsNerds.com and request a call with our team. It's totally free. It is not a sales pitch. What we do is help you put together an online marketing strategy that makes sense for your market, your risk tolerance, your goals. I do not believe in a one-size-fits-all approach to anybody's business problems, and we certainly aren't going to try to foist one of those on you. So it's going to be custom to you. If you're interested in doing that, like I said, AdWordsNerds.com is the website. Go there, check it out. Like I said, totally free. I really appreciate you listening to the podcast every week. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you next week. Cheers.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.